He's talking about, on your camera, you have an exposure compensation dial. Sometimes it's internal in the menu. Sometimes you have a little button somewhere on top of the camera or on the side of the camera. What that does, it allows you to override the camera's exposure meter, okay? And sometimes if you're in an area that might have either very light or very dark ambient light, for example, when you're shooting snow, when it's really, really white, the camera is going to see a lot of white, and it's going to compensate for that by overexposing the image, making it darker. So sometimes that'll cause the snow to come out a little bit gray. It will not look natural. In this case, what you will do is you will dial your exposure compensation a little bit to the right, a little bit lighter. So it'll become a little bit lighter. Also, on the other hand, if your image is too dark, you will do the opposite. You would move the exposure compensation dial just a couple of clicks, maybe one click over, to make sure that the exposure is proper, the image looks proper to you. Okay, so your exposure. Normally, we always talk about having your exposure be in the middle, right? Mm-hmm. In the middle, before you can take your shot. That way, your image is neither going to be over or underexposed. It's going to be just right. However, sometimes you may have to manually override that. And you do that by using your exposure compensation dial. Okay? If I'm somewhere where it's too dark and I see that my camera is doing a good job and it's making the image properly exposed, but yet to your eyes you see the image a little bit too dark, then you would override that by using that. That's something that you very rarely use, and it's really something that probably a seasoned photographer would know how to use, somebody who's experienced. But just know that it's available to you if you want to either lighten or darken your image, okay? Dial, then it's obviously not going to be centered, okay? I'll give you an example. Sometimes your exposure compensation dial may accidentally be activated. When you're gonna find out as you're running around with your camera, taking pictures, sometimes you'll bump into things. Sometimes you'll hit buttons. Remember I told you the other day, this is why I recommend you reset your camera every so often? What will happen is happened to everybody. You'll hit one of your buttons and it'll throw off your camera, right? But one of the things that gets set off sometimes accidentally is your exposure compensation dial, okay? So what happens then is you'll look through your viewfinder and you say, why in the heck is my thing not centered, right? Be conscious of your shutter speed, be conscious of your proper exposure, make sure that you're properly exposed. Look at all those things, okay? Before you take your shot.
What does that change? By going minus or going plus, does that change the aperture?
No, it's gonna either over or underexpose your image. It's gonna come out too dark or too light, okay?
But what is it changing? Which of those other items is it changing the ISO?
No, it's not changing anything. It's just the internal meter is going off, okay? It's not changing your aperture. You do that, okay? What happens is, this is gonna be said depending on the settings that you have. Depending on your shutter speed, depending on your aperture, depending on your ISO. Before you can take your shot, you gotta make sure that you are properly exposed. Okay, as far as the meter compensation dial, that's not really changing anything, it's just making the image darker or lighter. And you're only gonna do that if your ambient light is not proper to your liking. When your ambient light is either too light or too dark, okay? And then your image is gonna become exposed, improperly exposed, exactly. It's gonna be too light. Sometimes you'll take a photo and it'll look great, right, on your LCD. And then you get home and you go, oh gosh, once you put it on the computer, you go, that looks terrible. It looks either too light, too dark, whatever. And now what? You have to correct it either in Photoshop. This is why I always preach, get your image properly exposed in camera so that you don't have to worry about that later. Because not all images can be fixed. Okay, if you got an image that's too soft and out of focus, guess what? No amount of editing is gonna fix that. Once it's out of focus, it's out of focus. Okay. Subjects at about f8, correct? Mm-hmm. Why is that? Anybody remember?
So focus on them. focus on the subject.
because you want everything to be real sharp. What happens is, if you could do it like outdoors, and you wanna create a nice background, a nice depth of field, where the blackness is really blurry, that's nice, but that's not for the studio. You wanna do that outdoors, and the reason being is because a lot of times when you do a portraiture, in the studio, like I have a home studio that I use for that, right? A lot of times when you do portraiture in the studio, it's gonna be for commercial things, maybe like brochures, or maybe I do a lot of, sometimes I work with real estate agents, so you need to do it for there. So you need a sharp image that's gonna be used for publications, okay? So you can't really get too artsy there. If you're doing outdoor photography and you wanna have a nice background, blown out, you know, what we call a bokeh, you can shoot at 2.8. The only problem that I always tell people when you're shooting at 2.8, you have to remember, yeah, it's a pretty picture. However, only a small part of the image is going to be in focus. So you have to be careful where you land your focal point. Your focal point, if you're shooting a person, first of all, you want a person to be kind of sideways. You don't want them like this, unless you're getting booked in jail or something, or your DMV photo, right? But anything else, you want to be kind of a little bit sideways. You always want that front shoulder a little lower than the rear shoulder, you know. So you'll see a lot of times they'll sit them down and put their elbow maybe on their leg or whatever. So you want the front shoulder a little bit lower, and you also want one eye to be in front of the other. And that's where, when it comes to portraiture, you need to be very careful when you're shooting anywhere between 2.8, maybe 3.5, or maybe even 4. And the reason for that is because if you, let's say you land the focal point on the camera, on the shoulder behind her, or maybe on the ear over here, it's gonna look weird. It's not gonna look good. But a lot of my photos, you'll see where the focal point is all that. And it's very easy because you can either do it yourself by moving your focal point around, or let the camera do it. If you have the camera on automatic focus, you'll see the little red dots that go out, right? And if you hold your shutter button, if you press it halfway down, it's gonna throw out your focal, right? And then if you see that it lands in this area, then you're good. You take your shot. But if you see that it lands somewhere else, then just recompose. Let it go and try it again until you make sure that part of the image is in focus. You hold the button halfway down. The camera is doing a few things. Okay, it's gonna, number one, it's going to meter the scene. It's gonna meter the amount of light that's in front of it. It's also gonna look for the distance up to your subject, whatever you're shooting, whether it's a person or an object. And it's also gonna look for a focal point. It has to have enough light. Sometimes if you try to focus in the dark, when it's dark, you won't be able to because the camera is not seeing anything. So the camera is not only metering the scene as far as the light to try to give you a proper exposure. It's also focusing on the subject. It is trying to find the right place to focus on. It's doing several things like that. It's also make sure you're white balance if you have everything on automatic mode. If you, like I shoot a lot on manual mode, so I pretty much dial everything myself, so I know that when I take my shot, it's gonna be hopefully properly done. You miss sometimes, but most of the time, if you do it on manual, you take over the camera, and and you come up with a good image. And that's really what it's all about, getting a good image, correct?
Yeah, that makes sense. I was gonna ask about the 28 because I thought that's different. I haven't heard about that.
So
okay.
I'll just go the basic apertures, even though there's some that are in between, but the basic apertures that we deal with in photography. 2.8, 3.5, 5.6, 8.0, 16, and 22. There's even a 32, but nobody ever uses that. It's too much. So remember, right here, there's a sweet spot, about 5.6, right? So you've got everything less in focus, more depth of field. And then over here, as you go this way, more in focus. Where people get a little confused is this. The lower the number, right? And it really shouldn't be, because now when you think about it, the bigger the number, you're gonna have more in focus. The lower the number, it's gonna be less in focus. So just think about it that way. I think it'd be the easiest way to think about it. And so, unfortunately, you know that a 2.8 only applies to lenses that are high-end lenses, okay? Once you start getting the bug and you start buying your equipment, first thing you wanna do is you wanna buy a lens that opens up to that aperture. Now, if you're never ever gonna do pictures anywhere where you're gonna be in low light, then you don't really need it, unless you wanna be artsy and all that. And that's really why a lot of guys do it. Now, remember, whenever we talk about any of this, we're talking about photography in ambient light, not flash, okay? Because flash is a whole different world. Okay, we'll talk about that another time. Now, 3.5, 5.6. This is your kit lens. Now, the guy in the video was saying if you want to get a bokeh, try to put your lens at the widest opening you can. Well, even with the kit lens, you can achieve 3.5. However, do you remember what your restrictions are?
No.
You can only achieve 3.5 if your lens is zoomed in.
Zoomed out, right?
Zoomed in.
Zoomed in, oh.
So if you have an 18 to 55 kit lens, for example, right? Most kit lenses, they come with your camera when you buy them. You'll get an 18 to 55, maybe a 70 to 300 or something like that, right? So 50, I'm sorry,
That was meant for kid lens.
so let's say your kit lens, just for the heck of it, it's a 55 millimeter. What is yours right there, Laura?
To
Look at the
200,
front.
it's 18 to 200.
Okay, 18 to 200. In your case, and you say, well, I want to shoot wide open because I want to get a blurry background, right? You say, I'm going to set my camera at 3.5. Well, guess what? Laura, it's only going to work at 3.5 if you have that right here. The minute you zoom out to this, it's going to open up automatically.
That explains why I couldn't get it to 3.5 today.
Yes. So in order to get it to 3.5, what you want to do is just put it at 55, or at the lowest, and do the Mexican zoom. Just get closer yourself.
Yep.
Right? Because that'll work. Instead of having to zoom in and out.
Yep.
That's why a lot of photographers, experienced photographers, prefer to shoot with what they call prime lenses. What is a prime lens? Anybody know?
No, I don't know.
We talked about it before, you guys. Come on.
With the red?
No. So you've got zoom lenses, right?
So a
I would
lens
guess it's
Oh,
just
that's like a high power?
You
No.
can't always zoom in and out too much, it's probably,
A zoom lens will have different focal lengths, right? Different and varied focal lengths. Okay? Now a prime lens, in addition to being a more expensive lens, it's also only one focal length.
okay.
Okay? So you don't have the ability to zoom in and out, which actually makes you a better photographer. A really nice one that's a 90 millimeter. Those are all the lenses that only have one
Purpose.
focal length.
Wonderful.
And so, the word that I was looking for earlier, it's a better way for you to learn how to compose your shot, compose your what you're shooting. Okay, instead of just sitting there being lazy, zooming in and out, you only have one focal length, and it teaches you to compose the scene a lot better. Now, one of the best lenses and most underused lenses, and the cheapest lens that you can buy, and I don't know why we don't all have one. I have one, but don't use it very much. Is the 50 millimeter. That's a 100 millimeter. I have a 70 to 200 millimeter, which is also 2.8. And then for my sports, I have 100 to 400 millimeter. I do a lot of sports, I love sports, and that's what I like to shoot with, when I do my sports.
So
Yes.
the 50 millimeter is not expensive?
No, no, I mean, there is an expensive one. Again, the one with the red thing, but you don't need that one. And it's actually, you can get, most lenses, for example, that are 2.8 are gonna be anywhere between the $1,800 and $2,200 mark, okay? For any 2.8 lens, pretty much, all right? However, you can pick up a nifty 50 for about $300. Which, believe me, in the world of photography, that's not a lot of money. Photography, I would shoot a really close aperture, right? F8 or 11, right? In this case, it's dark, and if I try to, and I'm hand holding it, there's no way I'm gonna be able to shoot here because my pictures are gonna come out very blurry. Because I'm gonna have a really, really low shutter speed. It's all about shutter speed. Remember, you have to have a shutter speed that allows you to take a shot, right? That's sharp and crisp. So what I had to do, because I'm walking around, it's nighttime, and there's not a whole lot of ambient light other than the buildings that are flashing. As far as the light changing, correct? So what I did is I set my camera to manual mode. I set my aperture to 2.8. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky if you don't know what you're doing. The most I can zoom out with this lens is 70, right? It's a 24 to 70 lens, correct? So, remember, the higher you set your shutter speed, the darker the image is gonna get. Well, I don't wanna get it dark because it's already pretty dark out there. So what I did is I set my camera at 2.8, and then my shutter speed, I set it at 80. Why? It's just above my focal length. Remember, your focal length, your shutter speed must equal or exceed your focal length, okay? So in other words, if you're shooting at 70 millimeters, you have to have at least 80 or above, okay? Anything else, anything below that. Always, when shooting, now write this down, this is very important. When shooting handheld, your shutter speed must equal or exceed your focal length. Now again, this only applies to shooting handheld, okay? On a tripod, it doesn't matter what your shutter speed is because it's gonna come out, okay? 80, right? And then, because I have the ability to do so, I set my ISO to auto mode, okay? So as I'm walking around, I'm keeping these settings, but what's changing, depending on the light the camera is seeing, is the ISO, okay? Unfortunately, not all cameras have that ability to give you an automatic ISO. If you have that option, it's great. Okay, I know you do.
I do too.
If you have that option, it's great because that's the way. And so the whole time this is happening, this is fluctuating, but yet your exposure is staying right in the middle where it's supposed to be. Unless it gets to a point where there's no light, then it's going to go up, but then at that point you will know because the camera will blink and let you know, hey, there's not enough light in here to do. It also has something to do with the shutter speed, okay? As you drop your shutter speed, there's more light. As it goes up, the image gets darker. So you want to keep this as low as you can and handheld. Now, I always tell you guys that the recommended shutter speed should always be 125, right? That's your recommended shutter speed, which is the default. However, sometimes you gotta drop that if you got somewhere where there's not a whole lot of light. Okay? I'm gonna mount this flash. Somewhere, for example, like this, right? Now, Susie wants to know, well, how are you gonna fire it? Magic. We're gonna be electrical, right? So, no. Turn this on. So this is a transmitter, we call it a trigger, okay? This is gonna communicate with your flash, right? You're gonna mount this. So what's good about this, doesn't matter where you put your flash, for example, okay? In this case, what I wanna do is I wanna soften the light. So I'm gonna add a umbrella here. Let me. Yeah. Flash away from the camera when you're doing portraits.
Make it softer, not so hard.
Well,
Right.
that too, but when I was talking about earlier about how you put in the
Red eye?
no, not red eye. You shouldn't get rid. Oh, we'll talk about that. That's another subject we need to talk about. When you're shooting the flash straight from your camera on camera, you're not gonna have any contrast. You're gonna have the really harsh light. But by doing this, by taking the flash off camera, what you're doing is you're creating a little bit of contrast. In other words, you put it to either side of your subject so that only half of your face is lit up, and then the other one kind of drops off. That creates some contrast. It makes for a more flattering portrait. Okay? So for example, I need a volunteer. Over here, somebody. Anybody? So for example, and you want the light to be a little bit high, okay? And we're gonna put you like right about here, right? Now, okay? So this is gonna read the settings that I have on my camera, and it's gonna give me the right amount of light. And I wanna put it a little bit sideways like this. And normally when I'm doing portrait photography in the studio,
And that won't cast the shadow this way?
that's why I want to put it high, so the shadow will drop out down here. When I do portraiture in the studio, I'm not using these. I'm using what they call strobes, actual studio strobes. This is just your basic flash that you would put on your camera, but you're taking it off camera, firing it with a trigger, with the transmitter. Now, in this case, I'm gonna set the camera to manual mode, and I'm gonna set the camera to we'll go 5.6, 125 and ISO 400. We'll see how that goes. Okay. Obviously, like I said, in the studio, I like to use 8, but we'll try this. And I don't know how I need to. This is my light meter. Okay. So if I can't get the light to come out right at the beginning, then what I'll do is I'll meter the light. That's what this is for. But in this case, I'm gonna wing it by ear, see what happens. Damn, it came out beautiful.
Oh,
Right there, yeah, a little bit this way. You know what another thing that you never want to have too close to the wall, because you will get shadow. Okay, pull them away from the backdrop if you can. One thing I hate is shadows. We didn't see any shadows on yours. There is no shadow whatsoever.
oh.
You like that picture? Like it?
Sure.
$20.
He's gonna make money one way or another.
It is Mexican.
You see how she's holding your hand like this? That's a no-no.
I wasn't ready.
Okay, so when you're doing portraits, you guys, make sure it's always very important that you show the hands. You don't want to show the hands that are cut off, and you don't want to cut off the hands in the wrong place either. Also, you don't want super straight. Okay, again, it's your booking photo or your DMV photo. We always say if it bends, bend it. So you want a little bit of bending your legs, maybe a little bit of bending your arms. You don't want to be too stiff, in other words. When I went to photography school, I actually had to take a class in portraiture and how to pose. That's part of our training, right? And that's the thing they covered all the time, is make sure that they don't look too stiff. And a little bit relaxed, You always see photographers about drop your chin a little bit. That's always, photographers always tell you that. That's the reason for that. You wanna just kinda look. Again, you want either shoulder be closer to you. You don't want it straight. Now, I always tell people, what do you think is your best side? Best side. Some people say my right side, my best side, my best side. Me, I look handsome no matter what. No matter what side, right? But people do have a preference though. People really do have a preference, so you gotta ask them, what do you feel more comfortable? Should I shoot the right or the left? So, whatever. Once you have them where you want them, you can either do, some people say, hey, I prefer half body, I prefer full body. Some people don't want the camera too close to them, whatever. I always communicate with my clients when I'm doing a photo shoot. What do you want? How do you feel comfortable? I don't want to feel very uncomfortable in the camera, just snapping pictures, that kind of a thing, you know? So talk to them, make them feel comfortable. And then once you guys build a rapport, everybody's relaxed, then we can take a photo, right? And I'm gonna do the same thing that I did with her, right there. Put your arm the way you have.
This way?
No, the other way. Or no, you're holding your hand like this.
Oh, like this?
Like that, yeah, there you go,
Okay.
that's good. And I'm gonna shoot probably right about that area there. So now, I'm not gonna shoot without flash, so now I need to reset my settings to ambient light. And how do I do that? I change my app, now, with the flash, I wasn't properly exposed. I wasn't in the middle. In order for me to do it now, using ambient light, I have to get my exposure back in the middle. How do I do that? I do that by opening up my aperture. Now, I'm gonna be able to get the photo with that flash, right? The same photo with that flash, and just look at mine. There you go.
Okay.
See? Why? Because this one here, we shot it with 5.6, 125, and that was with flash. Without flash, I changed my aperture now to 2.8. Look at